Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Cathedral of the Holy Cross. In a special way, we welcome Commissioner O'Brien and all of our leadership from the various public safety agencies and organizations of our Commonwealth here. We are delighted to have you here to celebrate this Mass. We offer thanks to God for you, for the outstanding work that you do in the service of the people of our community. We pray in a very special way for all of those who have lost their lives in the line of duty, and for the families and loved ones of them and of those who have been injured in the line of duty. For 20 years, as a young priest, I lived in Washington, and one of the yearly events that I looked forward to was when the Washington Post would announce who was the winner, the recipient of the most parking tickets during the course of the year. And it was always interesting because year after year, the winner was always the same. It was always the Russian embassy. The Russian embassy, I'm sure, received the most parking tickets because Washington's finest were always very vigilant when a car representing the evil empire parked anywhere that it shouldn't. And of course, the diplomats had immunity and so didn't pay any parking tickets anyway. It was like that game that you play where you shoot paint pellets at your adversaries. The Cold War meant that there was a spontaneous suspicion and resentment against other people perceived as our competitors or our enemies. In the Gospels, there was also a Cold War in the time of Jesus, not between Americans and the Reds, but between the Jews and the Samaritans, who had intermarried with pagans and perverted the religion of Israel. The Samaritans were not well liked. They were barely tolerated. They were foreigners, heretics, ne'er-do-wells to be avoided. When we hear the term the Good Samaritan, we get a warm feeling, a positive vibe. But when Jesus told this parable to his disciples and the others who gathered to listen to his preaching, the concept of a Good Samaritan elicited a gasp of disapproval. It seemed to be a contradiction of terms. How could a Samaritan be good? Yet Jesus knows exactly what he is doing. The Samaritan does not draw near to help because he and the victim practice the same religion or belong to the same political party, rooted for the same baseball team, or lived in the same neighborhood. They're different. They belong to different faiths, different tribes, different nations, different races. They have different ideas, different political ideologies. One watches Fox News and the other CNN. What draws the Samaritan to reach out is his compassion, his recognition of their common humanity. The man lying in the pool of blood is an enemy, a stranger. But in him, the Samaritan sees a fellow human being, a brother in God's family. The Good Samaritan sees the humanity of the man who's beaten and left half dead by the muggers. Like so many of you, the Good Samaritan runs towards danger, even as others are running away. He doesn't hesitate to go to the scene of the crime, knowing that his presence there would make him a suspect. Since people had such a low opinion of Samaritans, he could easily have been blamed for what happened to that man. The Good Samaritan is compassionate and he is courageous. These are the same qualities that we want to extol in this Blue Mass. They represent the idealism of the service that you give to our community. I always say that the Gospels are very clear in delineating the differences between the crowd, a collection of selfish individuals indifferent to each other who tend to push people away from God, and the community that recognizes the responsibility that we have to care for each other. Many years ago in Scotland, long before the referendum, a British aristocrat was rushing to London for a very important session of Parliament. His automobile became mired in the mud on a country road. The man was disconsolate when suddenly a young Scottish farm boy appeared with a yoke of oxen and pulled the man's car out of the mud. The Englishman was so grateful he wanted to reward the farm boy, who refused the money. Then the man said to him, "Let me do something for you. Surely you have some dream, some hope, something you really want." The boy laughed and said, "Well, I've always wanted to be a doctor, but I don't think that's in the cards." When that aristocrat arrived back in London, he thought about how he might reward the boy and arranged for him to have a scholarship to a very fine school. Fast forward many years, during a very crucial point in the Second World War, Winston Churchill was dying of influenza in North Africa, but his life was saved by a new miracle drug called penicillin. Penicillin had just been discovered by Dr. Fleming, who happened to be the Scottish farm boy that had received a scholarship from Lord Churchill, Winston Churchill's father. This is a true story, but it's also a parable of how interconnected we are. In today's world, where people have grown so individualistic and alienated from each other, it's important to realize that acts of compassion and mercy and love, like acts of violence and selfishness, have a ripple effect and profoundly alter human ecology. In a movie culture that produces so many sequels, like Batman 3 and Planet of the Apes 4 and Rocky 15, I think, I'd like for someone to write a sequel to the parable of the Good Samaritan, where the Good Samaritan's son is dying of leukemia, and the son of the man he rescued gives him a bone marrow transplant that saves his life. Our task in this life is to build a civilization of love, or there will be no civilization at all. The Jews speak of tikkun olam, repairing the world. That is what God has entrusted to us. Our Creator has placed us here to care for creation and to care for one another. Our faith life and participation with the worshiping community helps us to have the interior strength and the generosity to fulfill that mission. The first reading from Isaiah tells us to seek the Lord while he may be found, call him while he is near. We are on a faith journey, seeking the Lord's faith and calling on him in prayer. To live a life of faith and service, we need the vision to see the world through God's eyes, to see each other through God's eyes. That vision grows in the hearts of people who make time and space for God in their lives, who have a rhythm of prayer each day, and who gather with their brothers and sisters to worship God on the Lord's Day. If we do not pray, that vision will fade, and we will become part of the crowd rather than part of the community. In today's parable, the Samaritan is confronted by human suffering and must overcome his own prejudices and natural inclinations to reject and resent the adversary. But the victim must also have a change of heart. The first people to hear this parable, of course, are Jesus' Jewish disciples. They would have identified immediately with the Jewish victim and his view from the ditch. They would easily imagine themselves lying in the mud, bleeding, stripped of all their resources, and helpless. And then suddenly opening their eyes, looking up, and forced to see, horror of horrors, one's hated enemy as the merciful face of God. It was their worst nightmare. As a victim unable to resist, they're forced to accept godly mercy from someone they regarded as beyond the pale. They would have shuddered at the thought. But once they got over the shock, then sooner or later, they would come to the slow realization that sometimes it's possible to accept God's healing and forgiving mercy only after one has reached the depths of need, having been stripped of everything, even one's hates and prejudices. The parable is not only about the kindness of the Good Samaritan, but also about the conversion of the victim, forced to recognize that compassion and love can come from one's enemies. Then no one is enemy, and everyone becomes a neighbor. In 1975, I heard a sermon preached by Cardinal Wright at St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. The Cardinal had organized a Mass for priest survivors of concentration camps. There were over 3,000 priests just at Dachau alone. Several hundred priest survivors attended this Mass. Cardinal Wright spoke about an incident in World War II that involved an airman, I believe one of his relatives. The pilot was on a bombing mission behind enemy lines. He was shot down in the middle of the night. He survived the crash, but was unconscious. When he finally woke up, he was in a clean bed, in a simple, clean room. He couldn't move from his injuries, but he looked around the room and saw a very large photograph on the wall of a German Air Force officer. A German farmer and his wife hid and nursed him back to health. Only later, because there was great difficulty communicating because of the languages, did he realize that this family was willing to risk their lives to save him, because when they found him, there was a rosary around his neck. The farmer and his wife had a son who was a pilot in the Luftwaffe. Each day, they prayed the rosary for him, that he would be safe, and that if he would be shot down, that someone would take care of him. Jesus tells us all, go and do likewise. Be a neighbor to the one in need. See in each and every person a child of God, and therefore a brother and a sister. Your profession invites you to be like the protagonist in the parable of the Good Samaritan, running toward danger, putting yourselves in harm's way, to serve someone you do not know, perhaps, but who is never a stranger, but rather is always a neighbor. You are there to take care of the victim, the wounded, and at the same time, you are making the road to Jericho, the road of life, a safer place, a community. God bless you and thank you.